You're listening to episode 271 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Doug Smith and Justin Whitaker join us to speak about their paper, Reading the Buddha as a Philosopher. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Have you ever been asked whether you think of the Buddha as a religious figure or as a philosopher? Or perhaps some other description has been thrown in the mix, like teacher or healer. Every time I see discussions online and elsewhere about what Buddhism is, invariably how we describe Gautama makes its way into the dialogue. But what we may mean by philosopher has changed over the years, and there may be a dismissive view that the Buddha could be described as such. Doug Smith has practiced meditation on and off for many years. He chose to do a PhD in philosophy rather than Buddhist studies, pursuing a minor in South Asian studies alongside. He is also a long-time scientific skeptic. Reading Stephen Batchelor's Confession of a Buddhist Atheist turned him around to the possibility of a secularized Buddhist practice, one that would not require belief in the supernatural. He's now getting back into a more thorough study of what interested him most about Buddhism back in school, the Pali Canon. Justin Whitaker is the founder of American Buddhist Perspectives, an award-winning blog chronicling Buddhism in the United States and beyond, as well as Mindful Montana, offering mindfulness meditation rooted in Buddhist tradition and contemporary science. He has been interviewed by Tricycle Magazine, Om Being's podcast, Creating Our Own Lives, and the Secular Buddhist podcast. He holds a PhD in religious studies from the University of London, where his work focused on comparing early Buddhist ethics with the work of Immanuel Kant. He has taught at several colleges and universities in the US, as well as in India and China. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Philosopher's Brew herbal tea. Maybe make that in Russell's teapot. Our guests today are Doug Smith. Doug, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Ted.
And our friend Justin Whitaker. Justin, nice to have you back with us as well.
Great to be here, Ted.
I'm going to have both of you just say a little bit about your backgrounds. You've been on the podcast before, and I know, Justin, you've had some movement going on in your life since we last had you on. Doug, let's start with you as our SBA study director.
So I'm the study director at the SBA and have a doctorate in philosophy, done some work on the side in Buddhist studies. More recently, gotten really into particularly early Buddhism, poly-Buddhism, the Nikayas, that kind of study. And that's sort of what brings me here into this paper. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Doug. And Justin, how about you?
Well, I am just finishing up or just finished up my PhD at the University of London, comparing early Buddhist ethics with that of Immanuel Kant. That's taken me about 9 years and traveled around the globe a couple times. And recently I've turned my attention to a lot more mindfulness type stuff, sticking with early Buddhism, Nikayas material. My background's in philosophy, and so that's how I've come to Buddhism, and kind of brings me to, my contact with you and with Doug over the years. Currently, finishing up, like I said, my PhD and seeing where that takes me in the world, either in academia or elsewhere.
Great. Thank you both. And what we're here to talk about is a paper that you co-authored, Reading the Buddha as a Philosopher. So this is going to be one of our more academic discussions. And why don't I just first open it up between the two of you to ask, what made you decide to partner on this paper? What about this topic prompted you to go for it? Justin, let's start with you.
So I'll rely on Doug for maybe some of the origin story, but I know part of my PhD work has been, comparing the Buddha and the early Buddhist thought with philosophers of the West. And in philosophy, as it's taught in academia in the West today, we do that a lot. We'll compare virtue ethics with Kant. We'll bring even Aquinas or sometimes Muslim thinkers into conversations with ethicists and philosophers in the Western world. And I had gotten interested in Buddhism over the years and wondered, why aren't we doing this much with the Buddha or great Buddhist philosophers? And there have been little snippets for decades, even going back to very early conversations between the West and Buddhism, of people, thinking about this in terms of philosophy. But I think especially in the last maybe 30, 40 years, Western academia has clamped down on that and really avoided anything Asian, anything that had a label of mysticism, as Buddhism sometimes has. And it's really been kind of categorized as an other, not part of the great discussion on philosophy or ethics in the West. So part of my PhD work was defending the Buddha as worthy of being brought into this discussion. And I can let Doug pick up from there.
Yeah, well, I would say exactly the same thing. I mean, when I did my PhD, there was, I don't think, any Asian philosophy done at all in the entire department. Well, that's not true, because we had one person who was cross-listed in South Asian studies. So he would teach Buddhist philosophy as a kind of, well, he was a Christian philosopher, so he would teach it as a kind of a foil to what he really was interested in. But apart from him, and he was very much on the outside of the department. I mean, he was sort of off in his own corner doing his own thing. There was really no interaction between that and any kind of history of philosophy. It's probably worth saying that nowadays in Western philosophy departments, there tends to be a sort of a line between history of philosophy and philosophy as it's done nowadays. So you have sort of part of a department, maybe half, who are doing people like Kant, Mill, Hume, and so on, and you'll have the other half of the department who are doing sort of contemporary stuff, metaphysics, epistemology. And the hope is that the history can bubble up into what people are doing nowadays, at least by influencing, making them think about different things, think in different ways, look back on arguments from the past and try to bring them into contemporary discussions. And Buddhism as such is really not in that conversation right now. And insofar as it is, it tends to be in that conversation because of people like Nagarjuna, who was a Mahayana Buddhist philosopher, probably the best known Buddhist philosopher in existence. Nagarjuna's arguments are very profound and deep, but they're also very abstruse, difficult to read. They require a large extent of previous study They require a large extent of exegesis because they're very, they're very sort of encapsulated in sort of oracular utterances that are a little difficult to understand. And I think for a normal audience of Western people interested in Western philosophy or students of Western philosophy, they're probably not the best way to get into it, in my opinion. Whereas I think the philosophy you find in the Nikayas, the early philosophy of the Buddha, is very, very similar in its structure and in certain ways in its aims to Socrates, to the Socratic dialogues, to the early Platonic dialogues, to the pre-Socratics. They're dialogue form. They're very readable, a lot of them. There are repetitions, but repetitions can be overlooked or in potentially in a contemporary rewriting that could be eliminated. So they're very approachable. And so there's a lot of material there that strikes me as somebody from the Western tradition that is just really easy to take on board, or would be if it was actually studied, and it's not. So I think that's a real problem. And one of the reasons why I was interested in doing this paper with Justin is because I felt like, there's a lot of stuff here that should be brought over the transom. Now, I must say that when we wrote the paper, I was kind of surprised it would get published, because I thought to myself, this has got to be stuff that's just been gone over so many times that we'll just be, reinventing the wheel, basically, by saying the Buddha's a philosopher, like, of course he's a philosopher. And it turns out, not so. You can write what to me seemed like a very, in many ways introductory, although we do get into some detail, introductory piece. And, it's something that's new enough that, it gets published. So anyway, I was very happy with that.
Yeah, it sounds like this was a salvo into, let's bring these kinds of philosophical views and these kinds of philosophers like Buddha into academic discussions in philosophy. We see that in Buddhism today, that you'll ask, so was Buddha a teacher, a philosopher, what? And people will say, oh, he's a philosopher, always a teacher, and you'll have lots of different opinions, but it's really just a binary, he was a this or a that, without that academic background behind why that's being said.
One of the things that came up for me in our work is that we found in a lot of academic discussions different ideas of what is a philosopher and how the Buddha might fit into that, and how Buddhist teachings, just a lot of different opinions. And some people not trained in philosophy might say the Buddha, of course he wasn't a philosopher, because all philosophers do is navel gaze or talk about weird abstract things. So they think of philosophy as a very negative thing that they don't want Buddhism associated with. Others, maybe on the far other end of the spectrum, the very hardcore Western philosophers, likewise, just don't see his work as narrow and analytical enough to fit into what they're doing. And as we, survey in the paper, there are all kinds of opinions in between those two extremes of, well, he's sort of a philosopher, but more of a doctor, or the philosophy really emerges in Abhidharma, or no, it doesn't until Nagarjuna. So I find in academia, the discussion by, a great number of very well-read Buddhist academics, kind of just disagreement about what philosophy is to begin with. So that's the other side of this paper that I would like to see, take off, is discussions within kind of Buddhist scholars about, hey, what is philosophy? And where and why do we want to put Buddhism in there?
One of the things that I think is something of a stumbling block is that, to face facts, philosophy is a Western term. It's a Western concept. It comes out of from what most people know as Philosophia, the love of wisdom. So it's sort of a kind of a general study based around an approach towards wisdom that is positive, and an approach towards a wise life that is positive. But this is a Western concept. So, we are doing something of a little bit of a cross-cultural comparison here. And because it's a Western concept, the concept has changed in the West. Philosophy in the last 100 years is really entirely different from the way philosophy was two millennia ago, or even 2 centuries ago. It used to be that philosophy included such things as natural philosophy, which we now call science. It included study. It included empirical investigation. Those were considered part and parcel of what you did as a philosopher. Nowadays, especially people who are steeped in contemporary Western philosophy, they think of it as a purely academic enterprise. And the idea of a person walking around the streets, talking to large crowds of ordinary people to try to get them to do something, that sort of doesn't fit with the contemporary Western concept of what a philosopher does. Now, I mean, the irony here is, of course, if you tell those same people, well, what did Socrates do? They might come to understand that, well, yeah, he did kind of the same thing that the Buddha was doing in many ways. And so, you can overcome these barriers, but I think it takes some historical awareness to do that, which is, I think, what we're sort of pushing for.
It's a little bit beyond he wears robes and he knows things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us about the premise of the paper itself, and really what's the territory you're establishing first before you dive in and find this spectrum? What are your baselines?
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. The baselines that I found kind of starting out were these statements by respected Buddhist academics, people like Paul Williams, Noah Ronkin, who was a student of Richard Gombrich, had Suntak Cho, a great Korean kind of philosopher of Buddhism, and a number of others, I can do that, some of those, if you remember, who have said, kind of made pronouncements about where Buddha or Buddhism fits in. And just trying to organize those and come to a basic definition. And I think that's where Doug was kind of the central contributor on the paper is, what is philosophy? And how can we look at the Buddhism as a philosopher? He brings in examples such as John Rawls, Aristotle, I believe, certain parts of his philosophy, and saying, hey, if you pull these out, look at them, they can be compared. And with that established, we kind of set the Buddha up as a philosopher who puts practice or ethics as foundational and primary in his work. And we talk about metaphysics. We don't think that the Buddha completely eschewed all discussion of metaphysics, but where metaphysics doesn't serve practice, doesn't serve our life, then it's useless. And this is also something many Western philosophers believe too. They're not just, loving to dive into abstruse questions for no particular reason. So with that kind of ethics as a foundation, we lay out the Buddhist philosophy as a potential path forward for further comparison.
You should probably also talk about Pierre Hadot, which you know more about than I do, because I think that was one of the sort of jumping off points, I think, for you, Justin. And I did not really know his work before the paper, and subsequently have come to realize that Justin, you were perfectly right, and it was really brilliant to sort of bring him up in this context, because I think his interpretation, which again you know more about than I do, of Western philosophy, is part of the bridge that allows us to bring these two together in a sort of a more easy way, because a lot of the work has already been done. So I don't know if you.
Yeah, so Pierre Hadot, a French classicist who I believe passed away in just the last 10 years or so, reinterpreted or reintroduced classical Greek and Roman philosophy as a way of life, and really pressed that the questions that they were asking were questions about life. What is it to live? What does it mean to live a good life? And tried to press this back into academia. As we discussed, these kind of directions have been lost in academic study. We'll look at Aristotle maybe for his metaphysics or just his ethics in isolation. Perhaps even Plato, we'll just look at his forms and forget about his other questions. So we've gotten kind of an impoverished sense of philosophy, and we need to bring back the holistic nature of the ancients. And as we saw, and I've even found this going up to Kant and some other thinkers, they really were trying to give a holistic philosophy a way of life to people.
Mm-hmm.
So Hadot was pretty instrumental in at least reintroducing these great ancient philosophers. They gave thought, but they were interested in living, and they were interested in some questions about reincarnation, death, life after death, those kinds of questions that come up in, again, much the same way in the Buddhist life and his teachings.
And it's mirroring what challenge you're describing here of we don't have these tremendous philosophical views, ideas being represented, at least in Western philosophical circles. You're finding a hurdle in bringing that in. And there's a consistency there with, okay, so what does this philosophical view, idea, concept, however we want to describe that, what does that mean to me in my life? Because there is that impression of philosophy. There's navel gazing. It's book stuff. It doesn't really have any pragmatic value, and that's what you're pushing against. So say a little bit more about that.
Do you want to? I was going to say one of the things that I would want to bring up also is one of your other guests on this show has been Massimo Pigliucci, who is working right now and he's an academic philosopher of the first rank, a very, very good academic philosopher, who's been working on bringing Stoicism back into philosophy, not only as an academic enterprise, but more importantly, I think, as a human enterprise, both in his own life and to bring it towards the public as a method of practice for highlighting the good life, which was this is the I mean, if you study Greek philosophy, the Greek philosophers didn't think of themselves as academics. They didn't think of themselves as interested in theoretical questions for their own sake. What they thought of first and foremost was in trying to illuminate the good life. How do we live well? How do we overcome the ordinary problems of day-to-day life in a way that makes life worth living, or that makes life better than it was before? Is there a way to do that? Is there a way that we can come to that question analytically and rigorously and, trying to figure out how we interact with the world in ways that makes life easier or better or whatever? And also the allied questions of what is better, what is worse in this context. And these questions obviously are the heart of Buddhist Dharma from the very beginning. The question was, how do you overcome dukkha? The Buddha said that what he discussed was dukkha and the end of dukkha. I mean, that was the whole point of his teaching, was to say that we have this central problem of pain, of psychological pain in life. Which doesn't seem to be able to be overcome by any normal means. So how do we bring analysis? How do we bring experience to this problem so that we can figure out a way through it? And that whole, I think, direction of the Buddhist Dharma, if you were to introduce that to ancient Greece, I really don't think that they would see that as any different from what they were doing, just said in different words, from a context of a different historical, religious, philosophical background. But if you overcome all that stuff, which is really not that difficult to overcome, it's the same kind of issue.
Yeah. And Doug, something you said stands out for me as being eminently pragmatic in the discussion we're having today is this idea of what philosophy might tell us about what do we mean by ethics, because this question comes up quite frequently in discussions between traditional Buddhist communities, perhaps being a bit critical of contemporary mindfulness work, programs like MBSR, that cast aspersions because it doesn't include an explicit Buddhist ethics. And my pushback every time is, so which one true Buddhism do you mean? Because there are different ethical structures in there. And what do you mean by ethics? What is that? And so how philosophy might contribute to, well, what do we mean before we even have that framework to have a meaningful discussion, to know we're on the same playing field? That might be something that would help tie it a little bit. And Justin, you're thinking, I can see your face. Say more.
Um, I think, yeah, good question. What do we mean by ethics? And when I do teach mindfulness now, it has to be a fairly open, I think, definition that we give, and something simply as vague as your day-to-day life in the world. You can't come, this is, I mean, going back to philosophy, in academia, a lot of it, not all, is you go into the classroom, you do some interesting problem solving, and then you leave. And none of it's meant to stay with you and shape your day-to-day life. And I'm critical of that, and I would be critical of any kind of meditation or mindfulness teacher who says, oh, come, sit for 30 or 60 minutes, and then go on into your daily life. And never the two need to meet. If if you're going to make this holistic, the way I think the Buddha and ancient Greek philosophers wanted it to be, you need to contemplate your life, how you're living it, how that creates or disperses strife. And this is going to come into your meditation practice, right? Your ethics, your anger or your greed or your delusional ideologies. And if you don't deal with those off the cushion, your meditation on the cushion is never going to go anywhere. In fact, people have talked about, you can sit on the cushion and really hone your ability to satisfy your greed. And if you don't tell people, you got to think about, greed, anger, delusive ideologies. These are kind of ethical things. So that's where I think we can't leave those out. And those are vague. You can, a Christian can agree that those are problematic, an atheist, a Buddhist. So they don't need to be set in any particular ism. But I think for our life to work, for meditation or philosophy to work, those need to be incorporated.
It's interesting that this same topic came up in a different podcast, and the area of exploration was, what if rather than ethics being a structured set of thou shalt nots, essentially, what if ethics were viewed as a flexible framework of awareness of conditions and our behavior within those conditions and what those results are, rather than the set of prescribed behaviors. It's those behaviors, one challenge that they face when that's something that's laid down in stone is that circumstances and times change, and they don't apply to every single instance. It's always wrong to kill the mosquito, the suffering animal, perhaps the suffering loved one, things like that, with an ethos that is more based on what is the best in the moment to promote well-being. And I even get a little hesitant to go that far. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, one thing that comes up for me bringing this back towards the issue of academia has to do with the fact that a lot of when in the West we get into an issue of discussing ethics, one of the issues has to do with foundationalisms of ethics. In other words, which school you're in. Are you a utilitarian? Are you a Kantian? How do you ground these ethical claims in some kind of structure which is itself obvious or can be proven some other way? There's a very good paper that we cited in our paper by Abraham Velasquez, where he basically argues that you can look at the Buddhist system and find commonalities with virtually or potentially every Western philosophical system. There's ways in which the Buddha seems to have been a utilitarian. There's ways in which he seems to have been a virtue ethicist. There's ways in which he seems Kantian, so on and so forth. And one of the things, though, that I think is so interesting about the Buddha's approach to this is that I think in a certain way, I mean, obviously this wasn't intentional, but it certainly seems from the outside as though that was almost, sort of baked into it. He didn't really care about the foundations. He never gives a kind of a foundationalist argument for I want to say anything in the suttas. I mean, he doesn't try to bring things to first principles in that sense. He doesn't try to justify ethical principles by using some sort of a lengthy academic type argument, bringing it back to those kinds of first principles of, this is the ethical principle around which we have to live our lives. Instead, ethics tends, at least to my estimation, the Nikayas, to be something that's much more rough and ready. I mean, he does talk in a general way about how all people, all beings, like to avoid suffering, but that's kind of the kind of limit to his generalities. Otherwise, he tends to deal in more sort of a rough and ready daily life kind of ethics. I don't know. What do you have a feeling about that, Justin?
I wonder what you think about the Dharma as a foundational term that the Buddha kind of adopts from the culture and, changes it as he does other important terms. But it seems that the Dharma is somewhat foundational, as kind of vague as kind of Western terms like law or, logos. But these things are kind of there as a grounding. And when the Buddha wants to push people, he tries to get them more in alignment with the Dharma. And then terms that come out of this, like kusala, akusala, skillful, unskillful, he gives kind of general direction of things that drive us toward or away from knowing things as they are. And I see that there are kind of a constellation, I would say, of somewhat foundationalist terms, never, I guess, emerging as they do in post-Enlightenment Western thought, but might be worth, comparing with some kind of Greek or Latin ideas that are kind of there as a given foundation.
Well, yeah, I mean, terms like Dharma, like akusala or akusala, to my way of thinking, show that he is an ethical realist. I mean, he does believe that these things really are, it's not some kind of a construct. I mean, there are better and worse ways to act. There is a set of teachings that he has provided to us that actually do, in his estimation, lead to enlightenment, lead to awakening. But I don't get the sense that he is trying to provide a structured system in the same way that you find it in, say, Kant or in the utilitarians, where, if you want to find out if an action is good or not, you have to do a certain kind of derivation.
Right. It seems to be less of an imposed structure of here's what is and how we can make the magic pachinko machine do what we want. It's more of a here's observations about how the world works. This seemed to me, it always echoed more of the realm of a scientific endeavor of we do this, we experiment. This is what happens. These are results we see. When we change these parts of the formula, we get different results. And that's how this reads rather than, and so Doug, I would agree with what I think is your perception of that realist aspect of it. This is how the world works.
And kind of coming back to your question about rules imposed, Ted, we do find in early Buddhism the 5 lay precepts, and that expanded quite a lot in the Vinaya, the code for monks and nuns. So I see some value in those, especially as we're starting out as guidelines. I, sometimes think of them as, it's a dated analogy now, bowling, putting the little bumpers in the gutters so that, when you're going off course, something's there to kind of nudge you back on the lane. Without those, right. But when you get decent at bowling, you don't, or pretty good. You get rid of the bumpers and you just kind of do your thing. But starting out, especially, these kinds of guidelines, and I still offer them in, my secular teaching. I offer the 5 precepts, and as kind of a take it or leave it. This is a secular class. We're not going to make you into Buddhists today or do anything like that. But here are some guidelines, and Christianity has guidelines. Western secular ethics can put forth guidelines that help you out to make you think about your actions as you're trying to be more skillful.
Yeah, and I like the term you used earlier, constellation, as I think about these 5 precepts, very, very basic ones, being the star points, and there's still movement within that. And where I look at the 225 rules for bhikkhus in the Vinaya, and you see things like you can't carry salt in a horn. That's exactly the kind of ethical framework that I push against, that Gautama himself said, dispense with those lesser ones, like, oh, which ones? Oh, we got to keep them all. Really, none of you are discerning enough to be able to tell that. I'm glad we have them, though. I'm very glad they saved them, because what a huge insight into just what the cultural context was and what these stories were, and how really precise they were trying to be in providing guidance for people to live better, who maybe didn't have the opportunities of having bumpers, but were nonetheless in a very long bowling lane of life. We got to give you some of that foundation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I mean, for myself, the particular one of the 5 that resonates for me the most is right speech, because in a lot of ways, that's one that we don't discuss much in the West. I mean, of course, if you're talking about the 10 Commandments, then there's obviously a certain kind of right speech. You're not supposed to say certain words, taking the Lord's name in vain and all that stuff. But that's an entirely different kind of enterprise than what the Buddha was after, at least to my way of thinking. And in fact, the Buddha's teachings on right speech are really quite voluminous. He had quite a lot to say about, what kind of speech was right in what situations and what wasn't. If you feel that a kind of speech is useful in a certain kind of situation, then you can, find the right situation to say it, even though it might be hurtful.
From a place of compassion, that it is well timed, that it may not be well received. That's okay. That's the one thing that's out of your control, but the rest is within yours.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot of meat on that bone, I think. A lot that we could learn from in the West online discussions and in other places. But I mean, I think, we didn't discuss a whole lot of those kinds of rules in our paper. Maybe we should have, maybe we could have. But I think it's important to bring them back down to, I think, the general framework of the Buddha's approach, which would be, I would say, towards the second noble truth of seeing, look, that the reason we have this dukkha, this pain, this suffering, is because of the way we cling to things. And one of the issues with clinging to things is how we approach the world. And these ethical guidelines are ways to sort of begin to pry our hands away from certain kinds of clinging. I mean, theft being an obvious one. It's ways of putting a certain kind of, as you say, bumpers around our normal actions in the world that is going to make it easier for us to cease certain kinds of useless actions, certain kinds of actions that are going to bring us pain, that are going to bring pain to others. In other words, I think we should see those kinds of rules in the context of this general framework as sort of revealing his own awareness of the kinds of things that have worked in his own life and the lives of people around him, rather than as something he's sort of deduced from first principles.
So I want to give us a chance to have each of you talk for a few minutes about just one aspect of the paper that was maybe your favorite, or the thing that was the most confusing or challenging for you, whatever it is that you want to take a few minutes and talk about, or maybe that thing you really don't want to talk about but should. Who wants to start? Who's the brave volunteer?
I'll jump in. So when I kind of was rereading this over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that came to mind to me, and it's not necessarily so much encapsulated in the paper, but has it's a review of what I've said before, but the perhaps cultural chauvinism of Western philosophy and a lot of Western thinkers when looking to the Buddha or other Asian thinkers, or this has come up in terms of feminist thinkers, women, African thinkers, that we've really come to a place of naive Eurocentrism in what we look for as wisdom. And one of the things I like about the paper, and I hope comes through to people, is that we can open up our eyes to other parts of the world, other ways of seeing, ways of knowing, ways of just looking at how we ought to live in the world, and see some real great insights from outside our, Western European heritage. So that's probably a very short answer, but
That's perfect and well said. And I know that's something that you've both been interested in for quite some time. So thank you for sharing that, Justin. Doug, how about you?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree 100% with what Justin just said for myself as well. And to repeat maybe what I was saying before, which is that I think the early Nikaya material is at least, from my background, from my learning, particularly useful in this regard, just because it is so approachable. So much of it is spoken in a down-to-earth manner. You have real situations, or at least what are portrayed as real situations with real people. They don't feel canned, at least a lot of them don't. They feel like they come out of a real tradition of trying to actually look at the way the world is and come up with a reasoned response to our predicament within that world. And I mean, one of the things that I really got into and enjoyed in the paper, writing the paper, was, trying to figure out those Four Noble Truths and how the Buddha really, in each of them, analyzed the world into its parts, analyzed experience into its parts, the six sense bases, the six parts of the world that come into our senses, the six ways in which we respond to that by feelings of pleasure or displeasure and so on and so forth, breaking that all down such that so that as we understand that, we come to an awareness that everything that we are ever experiencing is a certain way, is always changing, is selfless, is finally unsatisfying in the way that we really want it to be satisfying. These are not only are they, I think, very deep, and not only are they in a certain sense unique to Buddhism, but there is a kind of thoroughness and analytic precision there that, even though it's sometimes covered up in the dialogic format of the teaching, is there from the beginning. I mean, it doesn't start in the Abhidharma the way some people seem to think. It's there from the beginning, and the Abhidharma was trying to bring it out and make it more obvious. That is to say, the later tradition, the tradition that followed the Buddha's death, where they tried to, bring everything into a more sort of a structured format, less readable, less easy to sort of pick up and put down in a nightstand. But what they were doing was trying to bring to the fore the stuff that the Buddha really had there from the beginning, a lot of it. Not to say everything, but a lot of it. And I don't know, that's something that always impresses me when I go back to the material. It's what I hope we brought across to people in the paper as well.
Well, for folks who are listening to the podcast, we'll be linking this paper as well as information about Doug and Justin on the episode page. So please come to that, read the paper, and form your own opinions about it. Our guest today, Doug Smith. Doug, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Ted.
And Justin Whitaker, nice seeing you again.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Tai Hei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.